Tonight, debt ceiling showdown.
The path that the Democrats are going, they're going to go bankrupt.
The U.S. projected to reach the debt limit as early as today.
We will not be doing any negotiation over the debt ceiling.
Plus, Russia's war on Ukraine.
We're determined to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to succeed on the battlefield.
The U.S. and United Kingdom reaffirm their support for the Ukrainians. And online exploitation. Social media platforms have become hubs for sexual predators.
What we see over and over again is the hypersexualization of both boys and girls.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
A ticking time bomb for America's finances. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. In Washington, I'm Caitlin Burke. The United States will likely reach the limit on how much money it can borrow to pay its bills as soon as Thursday. Raising that debt ceiling is setting up a Capitol Hill showdown that could have multiple economic impacts. Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us now. Matt, how close are lawmakers to working this out?
Well, right now, Caitlin, not very close. The United States is about to hit its $31.5 trillion debt cap. And if lawmakers can't come together on a solution for this, the worry then turns to how bad the economy could be impacted. But Republicans say before anything can get done, Democrats need to come to the table. Lawmakers in the White House will try to avoid any fiscal crisis that could come from gridlock. The limit caps how much debt the government can have, and Congress has regularly raised the ceiling so the government can keep paying its bills and not default on the debt. The White House has made its position clear.
In the past, we have seen this. We have seen both Republicans and Democrats come together to deal with this issue. It is one of the basic items that Congress has to deal with, and it should be done without conditions. So there's going to be no negotiation over it. This is something that must get done.
Even the threat of default can be bad for the economy and livelihoods while creating volatility in the stock market. While Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned about this week's deadline, she can use extraordinary measures and likely move money around until the summer as lawmakers figure out what to do next.
The fact of the matter is we can do deficit reduction. We can deal with our national debt. But at the same time, the last thing we ought to be doing is playing chicken with the American economy.
The divided Congress complicates the situation. The House Republican majority wants spending cuts in exchange for raising the ceiling.
And we know where we're sitting at, almost $32 trillion in debt. How could you do this to a future generation that in anything we do, why wouldn't we sit down and talk, and especially with something as serious as debt, but as serious as a debt limit? Why would you want to wait till the end?
Republicans are also urging Democrats to come to the negotiating table.
Both sides are going to have to be willing to work together. We have a large groups on both sides of the aisle that's my way or the highway. That does not work in our country. And I encourage President Biden to reach out to the leadership on the Republican side. You know, in the last 2 years, he's invited the Republican leadership to the White House twice. That's not a very good record, but we got to do our part too.
Now, some of those extraordinary measures include suspending programs or investments for some government programs. This is also shaping up to be Kevin McCarthy's first real test of his leadership after the long fight that finally ended with him becoming House Speaker. Caitlin.
Thanks, Matt. Joining me now is David Bahnsen. He's the creator of the 6-part series No Free Lunch in Defense of Free Enterprise. He's also founder and managing partner at the Bahnsen Group. David, what could a debt ceiling stalemate mean for the American economy?
I think it has more to do with a scare into financial markets, largely misunderstood in that it can enhance volatility. People worried in either the stock market or bond market that it means something more significant. What I don't think it means is what a lot of left-wing media is sort of fear-mongering around, which is that they would literally default on their debt. And this shouldn't be hard to define. A default means a failure to make a principal or interest payment on one's debt. The United States Treasury has ample cash flows many times over to pay its debt. And so if there is to be a political stalemate on this debt ceiling, which I hope there is not, and I think is an absurd way of getting to where we want to go, but if there were, it would not mean a default on the debt.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. The new Republican head of the House Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Jason Smith, says Americans are calling on Congress to get our fiscal house in order. How do you think that lawmakers need to go about doing that?
By lawmaking. I think that Congress has been tasked with the burden in the Constitution of legislating. And so the way in which money gets spent that we don't have is because of lawmaking. The legislators are spending and approving budgets and appropriating monies above and beyond what we have. The debt ceiling is just a mechanical and bureaucratic component of how Treasury operates. If Congress doesn't want us to spend up until the debt limit or above the debt limit, Congress doesn't need to approve the spending. And this is where I believe we're making a big mistake. I value the idea of a balanced budget, a right-sized government spending within its means, but using the debt ceiling as a way to sort of manipulate expenditures that have already been approved by Congress is, I think, unfortunate, and it never ends up working out.
All right, so we've got that stalemate on the Hill, and we've also got recession, which has become an economic buzzword these days, continuing to be talked about. Do you think that's where we're headed in 2023?
I'd be surprised if we avoided a recession. I don't know that that is going to end up being the operative question, though. I think it could very well hinge on how severe of a recession we have. And I think back to the 2002 recession when George W. Bush was president. It was only 2 quarters. It was very shallow. It really largely only affected a particular group, largely in the technology sector. And I think it's very possible we end up with a recession like that. But based on the Fed tightening that we saw in 2022 and the need for purging some of the excesses we had, housing was way too high. There was a lot of those things going on. It's difficult to imagine getting off of that without a recession. I don't believe we need a recession to get rid of inflation. I think that's awful economic thinking. But at this point, it looks like when you look at industrial production, manufacturing, some of the things that speak to robust American economic growth, they're definitely lagging.
All right, David Bahnsen, we appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
In other news, the U.S. is reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine. As Russia's 11-month-long invasion stretches on, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has highlighted the U.S. willingness to back the Ukrainian government for as long as it takes.
The bottom line is we are determined to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to succeed on the battlefield. As we've said, the fastest way to bring this war to a just and durable end, to get to diplomacy, to get to a negotiation, is to give Ukraine a strong hand on the battlefield. That's exactly what we're doing.
Let's bring in John Hardy now, Russia Program Deputy Director with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. John, welcome to Faith Nation. You just heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken say the fastest way to end the war in Ukraine is diplomacy and negotiation. Do you agree with that? And what do you think it would take for Putin to truly be ready for that option?
Well, I think what he was trying to say is the fastest way we get to a place where we can negotiate is to supply Ukraine with weapons and other support. And I certainly agree with that sentiment. I don't think the time is ripe right now for negotiations. In fact, I think they would perversely prolong the war by giving Russia the time it needs to rest and refit and then come back with another offensive. I think what we need to do right now is supply Ukraine with as much military aid as possible while tightening sanctions on Russia. And I was encouraged to see the recent $3 billion U.S. package for Ukraine. Other allies are pitching in. What we need to do right now is really muster all the support we can and send it Kyiv's way.
Do you think we'll see any significant changes to Putin's tactics in Ukraine this year?
Well, I think basically what the Russian military is trying to do right now is regenerate forces with an eye toward, I think in Putin's mind, going back on the offensive. So we saw Russia mobilize around 300,000 troops beginning last September. and many of those are still being trained in Russia as well as Belarus. So I think what Putin wants to do is to use those troops that are still being trained. We're seeing much better training than the mobilized forces that were just thrown straight in. So use the other group as sort of a combat reserve to replenish Russia's forces and allow it to go back to the offensive.
You mentioned the importance of U.S. support to Ukraine. Putin has regularly threatened to retaliate against the West for aiding Ukraine. Now the U.S. and U.K. have recommitted to doing just that. Do you think that Putin will act on his threats?
No, Russia's response to Western military support for Ukraine has been a lot of bark but very little bite. I think for the simple reason that Putin does not want any part of a direct conflict with the United States, and that's exactly what he would risk if he were to attack a NATO member. So I would expect that unless he has no other choice, he will avoid that outcome at all costs.
Quickly, in about 30 seconds, does Russia have the ability to sustain this war effort for a whole nother year?
Oh, another year, maybe not. I think at least through the summer and probably the fall. And I think we have to think about what this conflict looks like. It could sort of peter out into a frozen conflict that Russia then resumes years from now. But really, the key variable is Western support for Ukraine and how long we can sustain that.
All right, John Hardy with FDD, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
The state of COVID in America, the latest look at the numbers and the debate over whether the U.S. is still facing a public health crisis. Welcome back. Is the coronavirus pandemic over? Many House Republicans say yes, and they want to vote on the matter. New GOP legislation would set up a symbolic vote to end the COVID-19 public health emergency in America. Just last week, the Biden administration extended that emergency for 90 days, keeping in place pandemic programs affecting much of U.S. healthcare system, including insurance markets, drug approvals, and telehealth provisions. The White House hasn't said if this will be the final extension, but the Department of Health and Human Services has pledged to give states 60 days notice before the emergency declaration expires. For more, we're joined now by CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson. Lori, what's really driving the debate over whether or not the nation is still facing a public health crisis when it comes to the pandemic?
Well, the two main drivers, Caitlin, are money and power, specifically government money and government power. Because with this public health emergency, there's a lot of power tied up with it and a lot of money tied up with it. For example, a lot of power is given to the federal government, different branches of the federal government, the CDC, the FDA, the executive branch, but also a lot of money as well. For example, money that's been given, federal dollars that pay for vaccines, for COVID testing, for COVID treatments, and also a relaxation of a lot of requirements for Medicare and Medicaid, things like telehealth. So all that's probably going to go away when the public health emergency expires. It's set to expire on April 11th. This public health emergency only lasts for 90 days, and it has been renewed every 90 days for 12 times since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's going to change a lot when it finally goes away. But, public health experts, doctors, even the public, even President Biden have been saying for, many months now that the pandemic is over, that it's really shifted from a pandemic to an endemic, and it's not an emergency anymore.
And we've seen some encouraging signs of that. In the past, January has been the worst month for COVID deaths, and this year it's different. Why are we seeing such a better picture now compared to the last 2 years?
Absolutely. Praise the Lord for that. I mean, this January is just radically different in a good way compared to January of 22 and January of 2020. This January, we have seen an uptick, a bump, if you will, in hospitalizations and deaths, but not anywhere near what we saw last January and the January before. So, for example, we're seeing an average in January 2023 right now of a little bit more than 5 500 deaths per day. Last year at this time, we were seeing over 3,000, and then the January before, about 2,200 a day. So but the numbers now are about double what they were like in October, but they're nowhere near. They're 5 times less, 4 times less than the last couple of Januaries, respectively. And the reason is simple. A lot of people have immunity from vaccines or from previous infections. So we're seeing a lot of people still get COVID-19, but but a lot of people aren't being hospitalized or dying from it. Thank God.
Definitely. And do you believe the hospitalization and death numbers that we're seeing are accurate?
Well, everybody knows they're not exactly accurate. And that's because, for example, anytime any patient is admitted to the hospital, they're tested for COVID. So the big question is, are they being hospitalized for COVID or are they being hospitalized with COVID? If you're in a car crash, obviously the reason you're not there is because of COVID. But they'll probably still put that down as a COVID hospitalization. But it gets a little bit murkier if you're hospitalized with a lot of different things going on. If you have other infections, if you have pneumonia, or if you have a stroke or heart disease, sometimes COVID can play a part, be a contributing factor to that. The same thing is true with deaths. Sometimes people die because of COVID, or sometimes people die with COVID, and sometimes it's not so easy to tell how much of a factor COVID was. So we need to get a little bit better on identifying people with COVID or who die from it, people who are hospitalized with COVID or who are hospitalized because of it. And, this is something we see with flu deaths and flu hospitalizations also. We know that number can range in the tens of thousands.
CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson, we appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Caitlin.
Up next, the danger lurking on social media. How kids today are more at risk for sexual exploitation than ever before. An alarming new study shows most kids are exposed to pornography by the age of 12, largely due to easily accessible online porn. According to research by Common Sense Media, 15% of kids say they were even younger than 12, with their first exposure to online pornography happening before the age of 10. 73% of all teenagers ages 13 through 17 have seen pornographic material on the web, while 44% saw it on purpose. 58% say they came across it accidentally. Spending time on social media is an everyday occurrence for most young people, with many sharing posts about everything from the latest fashion to trying new foods. But according to experts, that open book mentality can be risky, as online platforms have become hubs for predators. Charlene Aaron reports.
While social media makes it easy to find and share information, child safety advocates warn it also exposes kids to harmful content, which can make them vulnerable to sexual exploitation.
What we see over and over again is the hypersexualization of both boys and girls.
And that can likely lead to bad results. According to the Internet Watch Foundation, 2021 broke all records for online child sexual abuse, with 252,000 web addresses found, including images or videos of children being sexually abused, compared with 153,000 the previous year. Lena Nealon is with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation.
Kids have smartphones at unprecedented levels. And of course, COVID just supercharged child sexual exploitation as kids went online in droves.
In December, new Twitter CEO and owner Elon Musk named removing child sexual exploitation content from the platform as a top priority. Shortly after taking over the social media giant, Musk cleaned out the 3 most popular hashtags that had been used to sell child sexual abuse material and added a direct reporting option for child sexual exploitation, a move Nealon and others applauded.
He's raised a lot of attention to the issue at large, and specifically what was or was not happening on Twitter to combat these issues. And he certainly seems to have made some improvements.
Nealon adds that more must be done, especially after Twitter also dissolved its Trust and Safety Team, a group dedicated to addressing the removal of child sexual abuse material.
We don't know if the proper resources have been put in place to tackle these issues. And a major factor I think a lot of people don't understand is that Twitter has created an ecosystem of exploitation, and they're unique in that they allow pornography. And whenever you have pornography with little to no age verification or consent of who's depicted, you're guaranteed to have child sex abuse material.
It's a policy in plain view on the tech giant's website. CBN News reached out to Twitter about the policy and received no response. The issue goes beyond Twitter, as this content is also prevalent on TikTok, a massive social magnet for teenagers.
You see young girls literally stripping and dancing, and in the comments, you see the pedophiles blatantly commenting, offering money, offering gifts.
Meanwhile, Nealon stresses the importance of parents talking with their kids about online predatory dangers, as well as the need for legislation to protect them.
We need to change federal and state policies to hold these corporations accountable. There is so much more they can be doing. They have the resources, both the talent and financial resources to really augment and prioritize child protection. But from what we can see, they're prioritizing profit over and over again.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Is a servant's heart the key to living a long life? One woman's story next on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, it's hard to stick to anything for more than 60 straight years. But one woman has set an example of doing just that, and for a good cause, devoting 61 years to serving at Texas Children's Hospital. Now retired, on Elaine Cooper's 100th birthday, the hospital shared a post honoring their longest-standing volunteer. Sporting her red and white uniform, Cooper served in various roles, from working at the snack bar to delivering mail and giving tours, and she went above and beyond, even taking Spanish lessons to better help her patients and their families. Happy birthday, Elaine, and such a great example of a life of service. That's going to do it for Faith Nation. We'll see you tomorrow.